Hello, it's now day one of our reading and study through the book of Daniel for this Advent. However, there is nothing particularly appealing about Daniel for the season of Advent. Yes, there are some messianic prophecies that occur in the book, but largely the content doesn't really have a feel that excites us for Advent, although it is a good and concise book to read, uh, perhaps easier to uh, focus in on compared to Isaiah, which was much larger and broader that we read last Advent. So, to understand the writings of Daniel, we must understand the time and the place. And so here today in chapter number 1, he gives a time marker, the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Judah. The king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon advanced against Jerusalem and laid it under siege. So it's around the year 586 BC. The Babylonian army has conquered Israel, its cities, including Jerusalem. The temple has been destroyed, and the sacred vessels of the temple, the furniture, the instruments, have been carted off to Babylon. So in Ezekiel writes that when the temple was destroyed, basically God left Jerusalem. This is the mindset of a defeatist people who have now been conquered, and their primary city of identification has been annihilated. It's been destroyed. And so it almost takes us back to 1 Samuel, when the Philistines have defeated Israel, and they take with them back to their land the Ark of the Covenant, which symbolizes the very throne and the presence of God. And so Babylon, because they are going to rule an empire, they need to manage an empire. Accordingly, they realize, as empires do, it works best when locals manage themselves. And so they will cart off some of the people with what seems to be the best potential. Those who were of royal descent, it says in verse 3, those with no physical defect and handsome men, those with wisdom and well-educated, keen insight, and those who were capable, so they could be taught literature and language of the Babylonians. This is something akin to re-education, as it were. Those who had potential among the Hebrews, take them to Babylon, train them up in the Babylonian ways. Then they can be planted back in their own land as some sort of puppet ruler who would be local, but yet would be loyal puppet rulers, client rulers, on behalf of the empire. And so once more, as we so often see in testaments, both Old and New, the story is very much about the Hebrews against the empire. In fact, in the book of Genesis, there we find in chapter number 10, the Tower of Babel. And Babel was an antecedent of Babylon. And there it was symbolized the beginning of human government, the beginning of empire. In fact, also in Genesis, we begin to see some dialogue between those like Abraham and Egypt, kind of preparing us for what occurs in Exodus when the empire of that time has taken into slavery the Hebrew people. We see throughout the prophets there is this warning of what's going to happen when Babylon comes in. We see it in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And in the book of Lamentations of Jeremiah, we see the response to what the Babylonians do in Jerusalem. We see it in many of the minor prophets as well. And some of the other literature, like Esther, we see that there it is the Hebrews who are threatened by the empire, those that come after Babylon, the Persians. And so, in a nutshell, the scripture very much, and then when we get into the New Testament, deals with Rome. Scripture very much is addressing and responding to the political scene of their time, usually in the form of great empires. So these people who have been carted off to Babylon are in a form of exile. They have been exiled, removed from their land. Others have been removed as well during this what's called the Babylonian captivity. The idea is if you transplant people, then people will be fighting much smaller, more localized battles. If your neighbors have been relocated to another community and outsiders have been located into your community, then you're going to have small contentions between your local clans and villages, within your villages even, and you're going to be wore out fighting these new outsiders, and you're not going to be so concerned with trying to overthrow the empire. So it's an exile that has occurred. Again, this is something that we have cataloged within Testaments, Old and New. Going back to Genesis 3, Adam and Eve exiled from the garden. Genesis 10, after Babel, the Tower of Babel, there was a dispersing of people. There was an exile. The narrative occurs again and again and again. So, what comes into focus in this first chapter is diet. And to the Hebrews, you will recall that dietary markers are of extreme import. It was how they asserted their identity was by what they put into their digestive system. And as the king of Babylon, as Nebuchadnezzar and his cabinet is going to try to incorporate these Hebrews into Babylonian culture, one of the ways is going to be through food. And so in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily ration, royal delicacies, and wine. And this was going to be a 3-year training process. And not only did they assign them this food, but they also changed the names. And so we have here who we know it to be Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Daniel's name they had changed to Belteshazzar, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are actually the Babylonian given names of these characters. And so it's bad enough that they changed the name. That's quite an identity change. But they're trying to incorporate them into the king's diet. Probably some benefits to eating from the king's table. Part of that was drinking wine, but the problem becomes that this becomes a surrogate. They are trying to incorporate and assimilate you into the empire. And so where are you going to take a stand? Well, Daniel is going to decide that he's going to take a stand in terms of the diet. This is how Daniel will resist the empire, through an assertion that you can't get into my belly. We have a saying that a way into a man's heart is through the belly, and evidently the Babylonians knew this. And for some, their loyalties could likely be bought through their bellies. Many of you have heard me discuss the scarcity of food, the massive starvation, malnourishment, and things of that nature in the ancient world. And so if you could eat at the king's table, then you were It was quite a benefit. But how can you drink wine in Babylon when you know your people back at home are suffering? And so Daniel has to choose the way he is going to resist. He does not want to defile himself, it says. Maybe it is that the king's diet is something that's non-kosher, that's not appropriate for Hebrews. But I'm not quite certain that that's the case. I think that it very well may be to Daniel participating in this diet program is defilement because of what it represents. So Daniel is going to present an alternative. I need an alternative diet. But those who are overseeing this dietary program are concerned. If he looks malnourished compared to the other men, then the king is going to have someone to blame, and it's going to be those who are in charge of the diet. So Daniel proposes in verse 12 that an idea for doing a 10-day test study, a case study, a test with he and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them commonly as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So for 10 days, they're going to have vegetables and water, and Daniel makes the guarantee that their appearance is going to be better than their counterparts who are partaking of the king's diet. Okay, so they're given that opportunity. Well, wouldn't you know that after 10 days go by, their appearance is healthier, and Daniel wins. In fact, Daniel wins to the extent in verse 17, now God is giving him wisdom and insight into all kinds of dreams and visions. And so what's happening here is Daniel is resisting the empire, and in response, God is blessing him with this ability to perceive oracles, to have prophetic insight, because he has not accepted the king's table. Now Daniel does not spend the rest of his life on this vegetable and water diet. There's other texts that actually imply that he enjoyed richer foods later on in his life. And so as the chapter reaches a conclusion, because of Daniel's resistance, which was successful, which everyone recognizes to have been a successful resistance, the Babylonians are proud of him, and of course Daniel and his friends are proud of themselves. They're going to have an audience with Nebuchadnezzar, and this was a successful case study. It gets the king's attention, and they began to recognize that that these guys are 10 times better than any of the magicians and astrologers in the entire empire. And so with that, in this first chapter, it's in very subtle ways, Daniel has won a victory against the great empire. And so for a defeatist people who have lost so much of their identity, Daniel becomes a representative of the larger collective of what it means to live out an integrity and live out a dedication to his people, even while living afar. And so the story is very serious, but there's some satire here. There's some humor, and there's irony, and there's supposed to be in this story, as there are in the book of Genesis when Abraham is dealing with Egypt. There's irony to the whole thing, that these people who are small in comparison to the empire somehow are able to assert themselves and win these small victories, which to a defeatist people end up becoming quite prominent markers in their travel. All right, and so tomorrow we will address chapter number 2. Thank you.